Hello everyone. This is an introductory lecture for you in your delectation on working with struggling readers and writers in your elementary language arts classroom. Some factors that affect students' abilities to be successful in reading and writing include things like cognitive processing, motivation, and teacher beliefs and attitudes. I think that most of us are well aware that, cognitive processing can cause difficulties, as can student motivation, but I think often we overlook our own beliefs and attitudes as sometimes contributing factors in whether or not a student is struggling. So that requires us to be a bit more reflective sometimes about our teacher practices. Cognitive processing. Some kids struggle with code breaking. That's where you decide how to, what this word means, what this sentence is, that sort of thing, right? Maybe they don't recognize many words or have much knowledge of letter-sound relationships. Others maybe find participating in a text really hard. They can say the words fine, but they don't associate any meaning with them. And maybe they don't see that knowing how to read involves relating what you're reading to your previous knowledge and experiences. Others may not be able to see that different texts have different purposes, and this is why whatever they're reading isn't making sense to them. So there's all different reasons for why stuff doesn't make sense cognitively. Motivation and engagement. Boredom, right? Lots of times students can be simply bored or uninspired by the books that they're given to read. Often, they have a negative history with reading and writing that makes it so much harder for them to read or write in the present. You might find some of these students are the ones who find ways of avoiding reading and writing, like disruptive behaviors, right, that draw attention away from the fact that they're not engaged. Often these students don't have very much confidence at all in their own reading or writing abilities. Reading or writing makes them feel stupid, or not as good as everyone else, and isolated or not part of the group. Whenever they get old, or when they get older, such students tend to speak about their problems with reading and writing as a result of bad luck, or task or text difficulty, or they say they never got any help from anyone. Problem, it's not enough to teach students the skills they need to read or write, right? So sometimes we think that's what it is, but it's not enough. Somehow we have to develop within them the desire, the motivation, or what Dewey calls the interest, to read and write and to learn. We can't just use external motivators like marks, praise, pizza parties, etc. We have to awaken an intrinsic motivation in students as well. So here's a chart from your Tompkins textbook, Gail Tompkins, excellent textbook, on factors affecting student motivation and what you can do about it. If you find that kids lack motivation, what about teachers? What about students? What about teacher attitude, community instruction rewards? What about student expectations, collaboration, reading and writing, and competence and choices? What you can do as teachers, right? A nice little chart for different options that you can have to try to motivate your students better. Number 3, teacher beliefs and attitudes. It's a simple observation offered by Flint in Flint's textbook that what you think about teaching and student abilities to learn affects their learning. The author says it's important for you as teachers to not write off any child as impervious to learning. We must look for a variety of ways to help kids learn. Just think about the way that you talk about the kids in your classroom, either to your spouse or to your friends or to your colleagues or whatever, right? Or the way that you think about what that says. Am I writing off this child? Am I labeling him or her in a way that is kind of shutting down my ability to see that child, right? One size doesn't fit all, as they say. If you keep this in mind, and if you try to meet each child where he or she is in the learning, then you'll be on the right track. So when we want to identify struggling readers and writers during literacy events, you'll likely use all sorts of different measures to spot when readers or writers in your classroom are struggling. There's provincial reading tests. There's miscue analysis, there's in-class reading, writing activities, and running records. There's reading and writing conferences, retellings, kid-watching notes. The list goes on and on. Here's something, I think this is out of Flint, just on struggling reader characteristics, right? So different kinds of people struggling automatic word callers or struggling word callers or a word stumbler or a slow comprehender or a slow word caller, right? These are the characteristics of those different problems, and here's some possible evidence that the child may be struggling. So here's a diagnostic tool for you, in other words, in this chart, right? Trying to figure out what this or that student's difficulty is. Here's some indications. Here's the evidence that I'm seeing. What does that point towards? This chart helps us identify certain problems with reading and with writing. Some instructional practices for struggling readers and writers. Often we look at struggling readers and writers and we say they must be having problems because of deficits, like linguistic, cognitive, or socioeconomic deficits. So we often try to help them by sending them to remedial classes, and much of the time they're given curriculum that's watered down or that's slowed down, more focused on skills and drills and whatnot. So we do that because we want to help them, but maybe that's not all that interesting, right? Maybe it's not the most engaging or best way to help kids. It can be really valuable, maybe it's what they need, but it's not all of what they need, right? What about meaning? Maybe that's going to be overlooked if we water things down, right? We tend to emphasize code breaking and phonics with struggling readers. Not so much attention is put on text participation, critical practices with these kids. Sometimes this means that they don't get much opportunity to work on developing their sense for meaning making and stories and literacy. How are you ever going to love reading? How are you ever going to become a reader, like a real reader, without that love, that drive, that interest? Also, struggling readers and writers typically aren't given the leeway or time for self-correction practices that proficient readers enjoy because we want to help them so much, right? We tend to jump in a lot more quickly instead of allowing strugglers to work it out for themselves with decoding strategies. So part of it is just because we want to help so much, right, that we don't allow them to do it themselves. So the problem of confidence in reading isn't really helped when we do this. Person who is very instructional in this is if you ever read Maria Montessori talking about young children, about how one of the most important skills we learn as teachers is how to step back and let kids explore and let kids make mistakes and let kids do these things, and not to just jump in and show them how to do things the proper way, right? So the slower pace for these readers and writers also tends to just widen the gap between them and everyone else over time. It's hard for them not to get down or feel frustrated by this. So you can see, right, all these problems make it really hard for struggling readers and writers. They're just piled on each other, aren't they? So what are we supposed to do then? Well, see if you can pay good attention to student interests, student background, and also ways of scaffolding their learning. Also, maybe you can find ways to modify read-alouds, independent reading time, and comprehension monitoring strategies. 1. Interest and background. When students are interested or engaged in the topic or material, they often can read texts that are above their normal reading level. They try harder and want to learn more. This is why strugglers need to be exposed to lots of different texts rather than stuck in a leveled learning set of books, right? You're trying to teach them all the nuts and bolts so we get out the basils, but the basils can very easily kill learning. Well, let's get them reading something that's more high interest so that they can actually feel like this is something that matters to them. If you can find out what a child's interests are or what they feel good they're really good or expert at, try to get them reading or writing about this to boost their confidence. If a kid likes fishing, or you find out he likes cars, or you find out, she loves plants or animals, get them reading and writing about that. Provide them with lots of times in which to share what they know with others in class. Get them talking about the books they're reading on the topics they love. Okay? Use read-alouds to extend comprehension. Struggling readers can usually understand and appreciate books or texts far more demanding than what they can read on their own. So, read to them. Even get other kids in class who can read well to read to the ones who read less well. Read aloud to everyone in a class. Have lots of discussions about what you're all reading in these sessions. And during these discussions, model thinking about books and reading aloud for your students as well. This will help them with the meaning-making component of literacy. And independent reading time, too, a third component, right? Kids who struggle don't much care for independent reading time, but you can modify this activity so that it works better for them. For instance, you could try the buddy system. Lots of teachers pair an upper grade struggler with a primary grade reader. This lets the struggling child model good reading to some smaller or younger child, and he feels or she feels good about being the one who is better at reading. Plus, the younger child reads and enjoys the easier books, and the older child who struggles isn't intimidated by these books either. Now the older child has a purpose for reading easier books and so doesn't feel stupid. He or she can now work on fluency in an authentic manner. Number 4, scheduling easy-to-read times to gain confidence. All readers likely benefit from time during the day in which they can read something that is below their instructional level. Try coordinating this time so that you can match struggling readers with proficient ones. One way is to set up a time, say, right after recess for a reading group to meet for some easy, fun reading. Make sure it has a mixture of kids, some who are good readers along with some who struggle. The group should be fluid or changing, such that it's mostly made up of strugglers, but there are always a few proficient readers included. This way, the strugglers won't suspect that this work is being done in a low group. That's very important, right? You don't want kids to start labeling themselves as the low group or the high group or whatever. While you're doing this sort of activity, just focus on reading fluently books that the kids already know and enjoy. Don't worry too much about comprehension. Work with a few unfamiliar words is okay, but mainly you're trying simply to help them with their confidence levels. Number 5, scaffolding. Here's a handy chart, right? You see how it's got a vertical and a horizontal plane to it? It's on scaffolding. What supports or scaffolds can you put in place to help a struggling reader or writer? What might you do before, during, or after an activity that could help them? How can you challenge them and promote risk-taking alongside the other students, but also provide them with scaffolding or supports that will help them along the way? And how can you structure these supports so that they don't become like crutches for the kids, but instead train them to take on responsibilities for their own learning? So for a high interest versus a low interest book, or an easy or a difficult book, right? We've got moderate scaffolding for a high interest difficult book, low to moderate scaffolding for a high interest easy book. But, for moderate to high scaffolding, we've got easy to low, and for a low interest difficult book, you need lots and lots of scaffolding. Do you see how this chart works? So just think about where you're at, and this will help you decide how much scaffolding need I put in place to help kids, and also how do I avoid these scaffolds becoming a crutch for my students, but instead train them to take responsibility for their own learning. Scaffolding for literacy chart text from a Tompkins textbook. So again, the Gail Tompkins textbook, Literacy in the 21st Century. You see that she's done a kind of a scale here too, from high to low, levels of support, modeled, shared, interactive, guided, and independent levels of support for reading and writing. Different examples of things that you might try depending on levels of support and what's needed. Then there's modeled reading or writing. This is something that you can try. It's a certain degree of scaffolding, right? It's a kind of scaffolding that you can offer for students. Teachers provide the greatest amount of support or scaffolding when they model how experts read and write. When you read aloud to children, you are modeling fluency and expression. When you think aloud during discussions on literature, you are modeling thinking. And when you write in front of the class or a student, you are modeling what good writing practices look like. You can use this level of scaffolding for things like demonstrating fluent reading or writing, explaining how to use reading and writing strategies like predicting, using context clues, and revising, teaching the procedures for a literacy activity, or showing how reading and writing conventions and other skills work. Another thing that you can try is shared reading and writing. So this is the best or most common example is shared reading, where teachers read a big book with young children. The teacher does most of the reading, but often kids join in on the familiar or predictable words or phrases like a chorus. So it's less scaffolded. It's more interactive. You can also use this technique with older students. For example, if you're reading a book that's too hard for kids to read on their own, you can read it aloud to them, and then they can follow along silently in their own copies. Very true. And then shared writing works similarly. So with small children, for instance, you might scribe their dictations onto artwork they've produced. Or if you're brainstorming with a group, you might write down what they say on the blackboard. With older students, you might help them by filling out essay templates with them, drawing graphic organizers on the board or on paper to help them, or using a KWL chart, essentially 3 columns on a wall paper that record what we know, what we wonder about, and what we learned. And sharing differs from modeling, right? In that students actually participate in the activity instead of simply watching or listening. There's a KWL chart right there. Okay, another level of scaffolding. So at this level, interactive reading and writing, at this level, students assume more interactive role in reading and writing. For instance, they might support each other by sharing reading and writing responsibilities with one another. Choral reading and readers' theater are 2 good examples. Choral reading is where everyone reads aloud together. This helps the less secure or less confident readers follow along as part of a group while reading a text. Readers' theater is where a few students learn a story, then practice it and present it in a simple reading or perhaps a play or a puppet show, etc. In interactive writing, students and teachers create a text together. So actually there are some good YouTubes on interactive writing. You can find any number of them and watch them and get a good feel for how to do that. Yet another level of scaffolding is guided reading or writing. At this level of scaffolding, teachers still guide students, but the students do all the reading and writing themselves. And we do lots of this in university too, right? If you think about it. University level classes are often guided reading and guided writing. Mostly guided reading, I would say. Usually, teachers meet with students in small, homogeneous groups to discuss a book at their particular level or in their particular area of interest. And mini lessons are another form of guided reading or writing that is valuable at K-8 levels. It gives you, the teacher, a chance to instruct about various strategies or skills or genres, while also providing practice activities for the children to try based on your lessons. Then there's independent reading or writing. This is where students do all the reading and writing themselves at this lowest level of scaffolding. So very little scaffolding or support. They choose their own books and work at their own pace. They choose their own topics for writing normally. Teachers still offer guidance and suggestions, but mostly students are learning independence, and one hopes they're engaging in that life of the mind that's part of a longer lifelong learning journey at this level. See, we often think of this as being more like what we would call inquiry-based learning, right? Where kids are all kind of off on their own, doing their own thing, or in small groups exploring on their own but that doesn't necessarily give you the best picture of what inquiry-based learning is. Inquiry-based learning can have any number of supports, right? Any different levels of supports you can add to inquiry-based learning. It's just we most often associate it with independent reading, independent writing, independent projects and things like that. But it need not be. You can add in or take away scaffolds and supports as you see fit. Some instructional practices for struggling readers and writers. Another number 6 here would be comprehension monitoring strategies. So apart from just reading or decoding a text, struggling readers can have lots of problems with understanding what they're reading. In fact, they may be able to decode just fine, but still have no idea about the meaning of what they're reading, let alone be able to tell or retell the story they've just read. So Flint offers some strategies that strugglers can use to monitor their comprehension levels and notice when they've lost the plot, as it were. Here's a nice chart, like a flow chart that you can introduce to students, or you can even go through when you're doing reading comprehension, when you're getting kids who are struggling with understanding what they're reading, to ask, how am I doing along the stages here? And then Flint's text is really good because it offers you different strategies. If you're starting to falter at any one of these different stages, here's some things that you can try. So have a look at that on your own time. You can pause the slide. Other things you can do to promote independent reading among struggling students. You can create a classroom library that contains books at all reading abilities from 2 years below to 2 years above a grade level. Increase the number of non-fiction books you often you keep in your classroom. Often these books are high interest on specific subjects that kids may like very much, right? So more, kind of reference manuals, right? Also, these sorts of books often have lots of subtitles, graphics, and pictures that will act as prompts to support reading. Very true. Why not include comic books, pictures, graphic novels? Conduct book talks on easier books that you think are really good. Also, allow time for students to present their own books in book talks. Encourage students to read books that are part of a series. Strugglers become familiar with the way an author writes, as well as with characters across the series, and they use these familiarities to help them make sense of new plots and situations. And finally, helping ESL learners. There's lots and lots of stuff on the internet on ESL learners, folks. So don't feel shy about hunting there on YouTube. Some good examples of things you can do. Here's just some. Explicit instruction, right? Teachers usually present additional instruction on literacy strategies and skills to ESL or ELL kids. And they also normally spend more time teaching unfamiliar vocabulary related to their reading or writing activities. That's quite common. Oral language teachers normally provide lots of opportunities each day for ELL, ESL kids to practice speaking English. Like if you can't say the word, how are you ever going to spell it, right? This means engaging them in conversation as well as promoting discussions between them and other students. So lots of getting a chance to talk with other kids in the class. And small group work, right? It gives ELL, ESL kids the chance to work in small groups where social interactions and support, these things will support their learning. Also, reading aloud to students, right? Teachers should read lots of different sorts of texts aloud to ESL, ELL kids, including some that represent students' home cultures. As you read to them, you're modeling what fluent reading sounds like, and the students are becoming more familiar with English sounds, vocabulary, and written language structures, and background knowledge. Don't forget to draw. This is very important, folks. Don't forget to draw into play all the diverse sorts of knowing and experiences that ELL kids might have. Okay, I hope that was a helpful lecture for you. Thanks for listening.